Problems occur due to how we define x rather than what x is. And to try and make sense of that, to try and understand that better and communicate that better, both for myself and others, I've been doing this series, and this is part 3 of a 6-part series about 1 plus 1 equals 2. Now this seems like something relatively uncontroversial to say, but depending on how you define x, I think it can become very convoluted on one end or complicated on another end, just depending on the actual material. Now, with that in mind, I've been doing this series. Part 1, which I suggest you check out before this, was just about 1 plus 1 equals 2. Just a general concept of 1. There's no platonic form of actual a 1 out there. It's a concept that sentient beings can look at and agree, and we can say, okay, this is a single x. And if you add one x to another x, another single of that x, you get 2 of those x's. Now that's a construct, because a construct is when you bring certain concepts together and then we agree as sentient beings that yes, that's a construct. We agree as beings that can experience reality that that is now a different concept. In part 2, I discussed when the x is an actual other sentient being. It's an other being that can act and define itself. So yes, we have certain ideas of who people are. There's actual physical being, but that physical being can act in different groups, in different constructs, on different concepts of different things that can make this relatively simple idea of 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 negative 1 equals 1, into something different depending on what you have with that. Now in this third part, we're going to come back to inanimate objects. Now these are things that are acted on. And to do that, we're going to go with a piece of paper plus a pencil equals a piece of paper with something actually drawn on it. Now this is where we are with this. This is what we're going to be discussing in this part, and let's see how this goes. Okay, we're going there even smaller and smaller. So right now, you have a situation where you have the pencil, you have the piece of paper, and when you add one piece of paper, which is a different sort of x, but it's an inanimate object, but it's of a different kind, I would say, than the piece of paper. You add those two things together. You can have just the two things separately, or since the pencil has been used to put marks onto the paper, now is this a single thing? Is this a different x? So maybe it's an x and this is a y, and then this is x plus y? What would you say in this situation? So in this situation, is it two different things, or is it a one entirely new thing? In this situation, the paper has been changed from its blank paper nature, but the paper is still there. The paper is physically still all there. One thing that has changed is the pencil is a minor piece of the pencil that you can't necessarily notice, but if you keep doing this, as you know, over time, the pencil is going to actually deposit a part of its pencil onto the paper. A part of this, carbon? Part of the carbon will go onto the paper and create a new kind of entity with that in the actual situation. So on one hand, you can say these are two things of stationery, and that doesn't equal two different things of stationery. One individual piece of stationery, another individual piece of stationery added together does not create two pieces of stationery, but there's some kind of transfer there. Now in this sense, the pencil, as I mentioned, is something that transfers part of its being, part of its existence, part of its x, part of the concept of what makes a pencil onto the piece of paper. Now what happens if you add another piece of stationery, which is an eraser? You add the eraser here. This is kind of just a bunk drawing of the eraser. But you add the eraser to this kind of situation. Now what do you get? You get a blank piece of paper, possibly. So in this situation, now you have an additional use of another piece of stationery, and that changes this initial piece of stationery into a different kind of state. Now, is this 1 plus 1 equals 0, or is this 1 plus 1 equals back to the initial x of this thing? Now, are these things in kind? Because when you actually erase this out, as you see, you have a situation now where the eraser itself is losing part of itself in order to remove certain marks from the actual piece of paper there. You're getting into a different situation at the end here. So now that can become a little more convoluted, a little more complicated, depending on how you're actually treating it. Now, the piece of paper might not return to its original self. You can still going to have some marks depending on how good your eraser is. If your eraser is actually one of those more damaging pieces of erasers, if it's a different kind of eraser, you can actually end up damaging the paper while you're doing this process. And then in some situations, if you already have a blank piece of paper, but you have the eraser and you have just the paper, the eraser doesn't really have that much use. The eraser becomes useful after you have the pencil, after you have that ability. Now, with inanimate objects, now it goes into other aspects of what are the actual constructs being created? What are the things? The physical objects are the physical objects. But let's say you just have a piece of paper. It's X's piece of paper. It's Y's pencil. Y comes in and draws something on this. Says, okay, Y. They're going to write Y on that. It's X's piece of paper to begin with. But does this turn into now Y's piece of paper because they wrote something on it? No. That, in this situation, we have the idea of ownership, private property. Those kind of things are constructs that societies have constructed together. This is part of why civilization is actually built. The actual respect and acknowledgement of private property and things you can do with your body to act on inanimate beings. And then now there's actual ownership and things like that attached to what is done with those things. Because if I, for example, when I say, okay, I request somebody, hey, can you draw me something on a piece of paper? And then I provide the piece of paper, or they provide the piece of paper. They come down and they draw something on it. They give it to me, then all of a sudden, this is still mine. This is still my piece of property because I've actually requested Y to use their pencil and their skills and their ability to draw something on it for me. So maybe I'll say, okay, draw X for me, and then on my piece of paper, and since Y has done that, then it's still X's piece of paper. But if this is X's piece of paper, and then Y just comes in, and let's say it's also X's pencil, but they take it, and then they say, okay, I'm going to draw Y on it. That doesn't automatically make this Y's. There's no thing in there because Y has taken control of X's pencil without requesting it from X, without getting the permission, without transferring ownership. They have possession, but possession isn't the same as ownership. They do that and they take it, but possession also has some aspect of ownership in if you possess something and you act with that thing, the actions done with that thing that you might not have actually owned yourself fully, but you still possessed it, you still had some kind of physical control over it. So if you act with that, the actions of your control, X in this situation could say, they stole my pencil, violated in that sense, and then they kind of ruined my piece of paper here by putting their Y on it. So if X also had an eraser and they came in and decided I'm going to erase what Y put down on there, Y is not in a position to say, hey, why did you erase my drawing? Why did you erase that? That was not your pencil. That was not your piece of paper to begin with. So you already violated it. X is in complete full right to say, I'm going to return my piece of property, my X, to as close to the situation that X was before you came in and violated my ownership and my property rights over those things. So in this situation, just kind of thought about it. What is that situation? One, a piece of paper with a drawing on it, and you add an eraser, which is kind of the same kind. It's not the same exact things, but they work together. It results into a blank piece of paper. Is that one new thing? Is that taking away? Depending on the agreement, depending on how the drawing, the illustration, the pencil marks came to be put onto that piece of paper, that's going to really define in the end what happens when you add the eraser, when you remove the piece of paper, when you put the marks onto the piece of paper. So I think that's a situation where you can kind of see already how that 1 + 1, the piece of paper plus a pencil, or 1, a piece of paper plus an eraser, can muddy up the actual understanding of what that eventual X, what the actions leading to X are. So that's getting a bit more complicated. As I mentioned, the first part, check that out. 1 + 1 = 2, 2 - 1 = 1. The second part was about humans, was about animate beings and their kind of relationship. Then now here we have inanimate beings, which might have seemed to already been, oh, human beings, when you have animate beings deciding their things together, that's kind of more difficult. But no, this comes now into where there's also some difficult in there because I think you're maybe part 3, you're adding a third party, you're adding the concepts of 1 + 1, those out there. Then you're adding the constructs, I guess, which is things together, the actual physical things of the inanimate beings, and you're adding the human beings or the sentient beings acting on this. That's three things together that come and can confuse what seems at the beginning to be rather uncontroversial and straightforward. Okay, part 4 next.